When Conrad Roy was considering suicide, Michelle Carter goaded him to go ahead and do it. In the middle of poisoning himself with carbon monoxide, Roy reconsidered, got out of his loaded truck, and texted her his fears. She ordered him to get back in and finish the job. He did. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but apparently words can be found to hurt you. Proxy violence is the use of a representative or alternate force to achieve violence against a target without committing a direct assault, and often without looking guilty of anything. There are types of proxy violence which are societal, but today we're going to focus on individual use of it. This is usually an extreme form of relational aggression, or aggression in which harm is caused by damaging someone's relationship or social status, a la Mean Girls, where a person achieves her violent intent by inspiring, persuading, paying, or tricking someone else into aggression against her target. This is not to say that being a proxy for another individual's violent intent absolves the direct aggressor of any guilt or responsibility. If you do something, it's your action, your choice, and your fault. However, that a proxy committed the violent act does not absolve the instigator either. Getting someone to do your dirty work for you doesn't change the fact that it is your dirty work. In light of that, it is to be understood that while direct violence may have one perpetrator and therefore one guilty party, when proxy violence occurs, there are always at least two. The instigator and the proxy are both at fault for the damage done by the proxy's violent actions. So, how does proxy violence happen? The first thing likely to come to mind is the use of hired killers, a practice which represents a confounding factor in statistics on intimate partner homicides, which feminists often quote as evidence that men are more abusive than women. When a woman, unwilling or unable to take the risk herself, hires someone else to kill her partner, his death isn't going to be listed as a murder by an intimate partner because there was no intimate relationship with the actual killer. Neither will a love triangle murder, in which a wife persuades her new lover to help her get rid of a no longer wanted partner, either with promises of rewards or through manipulation of insecurity and jealousy. Both the instigator and the killer are responsible for the deed, but intimate partner homicide statistics won't reflect the instigator's part in her partner's death in either situation. Another area of proxy violence that has begun to receive more public attention in the last few years is abuse that leads to the victim self-harming, with reports of teens bullied by their peers, and in some cases even parents, until the victim resorted to suicide to escape public humiliation or other abuse. The proxy in this type of violence is the victim's own psychological welfare, broken down by the abuser's systematic destruction of every reason he or she has to live, often starting with the victim's self-image. Also making the news, though with less sympathetic coverage, have been the suicides of fathers like Chris Mackney and Thomas Ball, denied their relationships with their children and forced into impossible financial situations by their ex-wives' exploitation of gynocentric family law. Then there was Earl Silverman, driven to suicide by feminists for doing the very thing they claim men's rights activists should but never do, trying to run a shelter for abused men. Abusers who do this respond to their victims' suicides by attacking the legitimacy of the victim's experiences and responses, blaming mental illness regardless of diagnosis, and even character flaws, and sometimes going so far as to play victim by classifying the suicide as an act of aggression against the abuser. Michelle Carter's attorneys unsuccessfully used some of these arguments in her defense against prosecution for talking Conrad Roy out of deciding not to kill himself. This is one instance of victim blaming to which feminists rarely seem to object, at least when the victim is male. They didn't even wait for Earl Silverman's body to get cold before grave-standing on his tragedy to blame the men's rights community for not doing something feminists never did, but often claim credit for anyway. Creating and supporting a costly network of victim shelters with no financial assistance. How dare those lazy MRAs fail to spin straw into gold when feminists have spent 40 years claiming to have done so? And pay no attention to the massive body of government and charity grants behind the lace curtain. Another proxy violence method is white knighting, wherein bystanders respond to the instigator's victim signaling by engaging in violence against her perceived antagonist, often with little or no evidence and no effort at due process. Where gynocentrism and mob mentality intersect, a woman's tears can get a man assaulted, even killed. I'd suggest asking some victims: Emmett Till, Donald Robinson, Luke Harwood, Manos Economides, or Syed Farid Khan. But that would be futile. The dead don't give interviews. An easier to trace, but largely unaddressed type of proxy violence is the exploitation of police force as a tool of aggression, wherein the state is used as a Rube Goldberg husband-battering device. In past episodes, we've talked about the phenomenon of using false accusations as a tool of abuse. Karen even made an analogy, pointing out that if a woman hired mercenaries to kidnap her ex, beat him up and rob him, tie him up and lock him in a shed over the weekend, they'd be violating all kinds of laws. But she can lie to the cops, claim he hit her, and they'll do a pretty close approximation to that by hauling him off to jail and locking him up until he posts bail. This type of violence could largely be prevented by making prosecution mandatory when perjury and false charges are blatant and obvious. However, feminists have argued against such measures, claiming they would discourage women from reporting violent crimes. They also argue that if a man is innocent, he has nothing to fear. In the same vein, then, if a woman's statement is true, she has nothing to fear from prosecution for these crimes. The only remedy against proxy violence is to hold instigators accountable whenever possible within the guidelines of due process, regardless of their excuses. Again, that would not absolve their proxies of accountability for violent acts. It would just make using a proxy less likely to protect an instigator from legal consequences for harm done at her request. Hello and welcome to Badger Talk number 6, Proxy Violence, a Woman's Not-So-Secret Weapon. I'm Hannah Wallen, and today I'm here with Woozle Slayer Karen Strawn, our resident scholar Aidan Paladin, that adorable specter of death, Prim Reaper, and the ever-present neutered doge, Brian Martinez.
Consistently, what we find with a lot of social psychological research, and specifically psychological research, sorry about that, is that sometimes even the non-physical violence has a greater long-lasting psychological negative impact than physical violence in many cases. So if you have been, bullied by the police and who have institutional power, and you have been, outcasted and castigated, that's more long-term psychologically probably damaging even than getting a punched in the face, which is terrible as well. But
oh, I believe it, because I mean, what does that do to your faith in the system, right?
Well, I've seen it knock down guys' faith in the system. Actually, personally, I know at least 2 guys who break out in a cold sweat whenever there's a police officer around. And it's not because they're doing anything they're not supposed to be doing. It's because they know that the police officer may at some point do something that he's not supposed to be doing. And, at least not according to following the law. He may be supporting somebody who has lied, and he may drag the guy off at any time. This is something that it actually, I've seen it cause post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms in one of my friends. And he actually ended up getting diagnosed with that following a 7-year ordeal with false accusations and false arrest.
Well, I do want to address something Aidan Paladin said, which is like, the psychological bullying and things like that, and the psychological repercussions of just being shunned and outcast are often, more traumatic than being punched in the face. Well, of course they are. I mean, like, I've been punched in the face. It's really, if you aren't in fear for your safety or your life, being punched in the face is just like, it's just physical pain. It's not, like, people aren't made out of glass. It's no worse than falling on your face on the sidewalk, right? What is traumatic about being physically assaulted by, say, an intimate partner is that sense of betrayal, that they would want to hurt you in you know, in a way that is so obvious, or being assaulted by somebody in public. What's so traumatic about it isn't necessarily the punch in the face. It's the fear of, am I going to die? Right? That's what is traumatic about that. So, I mean, like, so much of this is tied up in emotional responses, fear, uncertainty, sense of intimidation, all of those things, right? So, I mean, like, essentially, the idea that physical violence is always going to be more traumatic than psychological abuse or whatever is absolutely, it's ridiculous. They're not the same thing. Otherwise, boxers would never go in the ring, or they'd all have PTSD.
One thing that we do find, and I can only speak from what I know from my research and my courses I've taken in pedagogy, is that we start to find these males and females separate themselves into these different types of bullying behavior from an extremely early age, of a difference between the genders. Women engage in more psychological violence from pretty much preschool forward, whereas males are more likely to engage in physical violence. And when we're talking about this psychological manipulation, this psychological violence, yeah, that starts real early on.
A lot of these very, very early feminists, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and all of these others, who were, they were feminists who, they were suffragettes, but they were also prohibitionists, and they participated in this sort of public discourse that set women up as the innocent victims of men's drinking, right? And set men up as these monsters whenever they drink. And like, this is the power that women have, is they could sway the opinion of a nation before they even had the vote, before any politician had to care about courting their vote, right? They could sway the opinion of a nation to the point where they were willing to change the Constitution to prohibit something that was part of people's everyday lives, right? Let's just get rid of it. And then what was the result? It was one of the biggest fucking disasters in American history.
No, it was part of people's everyday lives for all of memorable human history, and they thought they could get rid of it. And, you know,
yeah,
the same thing
based on violence against women. Based on violence against women.
And the same thing has happened with the drug war.
And then the feminists came along in the 1970s to tell us all, to inform all of us freaking idiots, right, that beating your wife is wrong, right? Because we didn't know that before.
70% of divorce is initiated by women, and the majority of single moms were never married. So you have, she either became a single mom by divorce, and I guess that leaves a 70% chance that it was her idea, or she became a single mom by giving birth to a child and then choosing to retain custody. Because you don't have to retain custody. You can abandon custody to the father. If you have family that wants custody of your baby, you can abandon custody to your family. And at least the United States, there's also safe haven abandonment, in which case you're not dealing with people. There's adoption if the father doesn't want anything to do with the child, and you don't want anything to do with the child. So there's 4 different ways a woman can get out of being a single custodial mom, even if she has already given birth.
What I find hilarious is in Canada, and I know this because a friend of mine actually looked into it, and she's been trying to essentially, because she went on welfare. She was pregnant. She was in incredible financial crisis. And, you know, she's like 6 months pregnant. Who's going to hire her? Right. So essentially she went on welfare for about 14 months. And then as soon as she could possibly manage it, she went back to work. But during that 14 months, of course, welfare went and dinged the father. Right. And she has been attempting to negotiate with the father to sever his paternity rights because he doesn't want them. He doesn't want any of it. And have her new guy adopt their son. And this has been a years-long process. And the only way that she could actually absolve the biological father of his responsibility is if there is another man who is prepared to take responsibility and who is seen by the courts as capable of taking responsibility.
So the court doesn't judge whether or not you're a fit mother. You can just pop one out and boom, you get welfare, you get child support, you get treated like a queen. But if you actually care enough to want to take care of a child that you didn't even father as a man, the court is going to sniff up your butt and see if you're a good enough guy.
Well, what's hilarious too is that, so essentially, if the biological father of this child was a heroin addict and a like 3-time freaking convict and the whole bit, right? And like they would rather milk him for cash than transfer responsibility to a man who is not an upstanding middle-class citizen with no kind of unsavory history whatsoever, right? Because, hey, you know, we got to have standards here, right? And like, I'm just blown away by this because
it's not about standards.
A woman can abandon responsibility for her child and transfer the full responsibility for that child to the state through safe haven abandonment, right? Whereas if she wants to absolve a man, the biological father, of responsibility, or the man whose name is on the birth certificate, of responsibility for that child, she has to find another man who the court finds suitable to take that over, right? That means that in our society, at least in the legal sense, paternity, fatherhood means more than motherhood, right? Which is absolutely insane to me.
There's something called parental alienation syndrome. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It's
yeah.
And that's exactly what this is in many ways, is that this is essentially using the children as pawns and using them as, like, I'll play them against the father, I'll play them against the government in order to achieve my financial and my societal goals. This is just another form, though, of domestic violence by proxy. Absolutely. Of using the children and Karen was talking about this, of the your dad doesn't pay enough money, he doesn't pony up enough. That's all a part of that, because of course, how does this get played out if the things don't work out in your favor? Well, you can obviously externalize it onto the father who's just not paying up enough money if things are bad, or if you just feel like it because you're being vindictive, because you're engaging in domestic violence, from an external standpoint, by going outside and being, removed from the direct situation of not directly even interacting with this individual, the person that you've had these children with, but you can still engage in a form of violence against them, psychological, and really to estrange people from their children, I believe, is one of the most horrible pieces of violence or just terrible things you could do to somebody.
Child Protective Services, CPS. The only 3 letters scarier, in the United States at least, than IRS. I would rather have the IRS sicked on me 1,000 times than CPS once. And yeah, they have secret hearings where you're not allowed to talk about what happened in the case. The same thing can happen in divorce cases in the United States and Canada as well. I've spoken to several fathers who have been through, really been through hell in the court system, in the family court system, where judges have put gag orders on them discussing their cases, using their ex-wives or their children's privacy as an excuse, when in reality, what's going on is the judge is doing something that is essentially illegal and very abusive, giving custody to a parent who is a drug addict or has a severe mental health issue, not just, symptoms, not just depression or something like that, but is hearing voices and listening to them or something of a similar nature. And And the judge doesn't want the public hearing that he's doing ridiculous things that are dangerous to the child with regards to custody.
I'm going to shill the National Coalition for Men's 40th anniversary and conference. So it's a conference and party. It's 2 days on the 14th and 15th of September in San Diego at the glorious Best Western Plus Hacienda Hotel in Old Town San Diego. It boasts a pool and hot tub, an exercise room, ironing boards for everybody, and allegedly stunning views of colorful slushy drinks with little umbrellas in them and mostly empty tequila bottles. If you are in the San Diego area and you would like to attend and see speakers like yours truly and others such as Fred Hayward, who is in the Red Pill, Mark Angelucci, who is also in the Red Pill, Cassie J, maker of the Red Pill, Tim Golditch, author of Loving Men and Respecting Women, and Vladik Filler, our favorite falsely accused person ever. I would suggest that you go to http://conference.ncfm.org. Find out the details. It's $300 to attend. You have to be a member or a donor, but you can do that by donating as little as $1. And yeah, so I'll be talking about Bill C-51, 2017 in Canada, and its implications on the ability of the falsely accused to defend themselves against wrongful accusations. And yeah, and I just want to plug Harry Crouch, the president of NCFM, who's arranging all of this, who is not just the most interesting man in the world. He's also an Adonis with a killer fashion sense and abs that make the ladies swoon. He totally did not pay me to say that. So go look it up and be there if you're in the San Diego area on September 14th and 15th.
All right. And with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and take us on out.